Somewhere in a windowless server room right now, there's a file with your name on it. Not your bank statements, not your browsing history. Something far more permanent, far more revealing, and far harder to protect. The blueprint of your body, your ancestry, your relatives, your risk of disease, the traits hidden in your children before they're even born. And here is the detail that should genuinely disturb you. Millions of Americans handed that blueprint over voluntarily, sealed it in a plastic tube, mailed it off in a box with a cheerful logo on it, and never once read the fine print explaining what would happen to it next. This is the story of what happened when that trust collapsed, of a company that once promised to unlock the secrets of who you are and instead became one of the largest exposures of biological data in human history, of police departments quietly building investigative tools out of your cousin's curiosity about her ancestry, of a federal government expanding a genetic database faster than almost anyone in Washington has been willing to admit, and of a simple, uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of it. Unlike a password, unlike a credit card number, unlike almost anything else that can be stolen from you, your DNA cannot be changed. Once it's out forever for you and for every blood relative connected to you, whether they ever agreed to any of this or not. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to a company that once felt like magic. Spit in a tube, mail it away, and a few weeks later, receive a report telling you where your ancestors came from, whether your biological database is on the planet, built not by government mandate, but by pure curiosity, one saliva sample at a time. And then, in the spring of 2023, something began happening quietly in the background that nobody at the company noticed for months. A hacker using an online alias began testing stolen username and password combinations, recycled from breaches at completely unrelated websites, against the company's login page. This technique is called credential stuffing, and it works precisely because so many people reuse the same password across multiple accounts. It doesn't require breaking any encryption. It doesn't require sophisticated malware. It simply requires patience and the assumption that somewhere out of 14 million accounts, thousands of people used the same password they'd already had, stolen somewhere else. The hacker was right. Roughly 14,000 accounts fell within the first wave. Here's the twist that turned a modest breach into one of the largest genetic data exposures in history. The company's entire business model was built around connection, a feature that let users discover and message their genetic relatives, people who shared even a fraction of their DNA. So when the hacker broke into those 14,000 accounts, he didn't just see 14. People's genetic and family information was compromised. Nearly half the company's entire customer base, cascading outward from an initial breach of just 14,000 accounts. One person's decision to trust a genetic testing company had quietly overridden the privacy choices of relatives who never made that decision themselves. What came out in the data was not abstract. Names, genders, birth dates, family trees stretching back generations, profile, the geographic locations of ancestors, and, most sensitively, genetic markers, haplogroup results that trace deep ancestral lineage, along with predicted relationships mapping out entire extended families. Investigators later discovered the stolen data being advertised for sale on criminal forums during a period marked by rising anti-Semitic and anti-Asian hate incidents, with listings that explicitly organized victims by inferred ethnicity, turning a database built to help people discover their heritage into a tool that could be weaponized against the very identities it revealed. The company's downfall from there felt almost inevitable in hindsight, and yet it still shocked the industry when it happened. Regulators in the UK and Canada launched a joint investigation and concluded the company had failed to implement basic protections: no mandatory multi-factor authentication, weak password requirements, and detection systems that missed clear. Warning signs of the attack for months while it was actively underway. Class action lawsuits piled up. A $30 million settlement in 2024 grew into a nearly $47 million settlement by 2026, still working its way through a bankruptcy court because, in a final ironic turn, the company that had once been valued at $6 billion couldn't survive the fallout. In March of 2025, it filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and this is where the story crosses from cybersecurity into something far stranger. Because when a company holding the genetic data of millions of people goes bankrupt, that data becomes an asset, something to be sold. A federal bankruptcy court had to appoint a special consumer privacy ombudsman just to evaluate whether selling that data to a new owner would violate the genetic privacy rights of millions of people who never imagined their DNA might one day be liquidated in a courtroom to help pay off corporate creditors. More than 24 state attorneys general tried to block an early bid for the data from a pharmaceutical company, arguing that genetic information this sensitive shouldn't change hands through a bankruptcy auction at all. In the end, the company's own co-founder purchased the assets back through a nonprofit for just over $300 million, promising to rue, handing the data responsibly going forward. But scientists and legal scholars who testified before the Senate about the case made a chilling point that still stands today. This was, by pure chance, a relatively reassuring outcome. The next time a company holding a mountain of genetic data goes bankrupt, and there will be a next time, there is no guarantee the buyer will have any relationship to the original company at all, or any incentive to protect the people whose bodies that data describes. California's Attorney General wasn't satisfied even with that outcome. In the spring of 2026, his office filed a fresh lawsuit against the company's successor entity, alleging it had ignored known security vulnerabilities before the breach and misled customers afterward about how serious it actually was. The most striking line from that filing captures something worth sitting with. Officials argued that a person cannot simply change their genetic code the way they'd change a password after a breach. A stolen credit card can be canceled. A compromised password can be reset. Your genome is the one credential you will carry, unaltered for the rest of your life, and hand down in fragments to every child you ever have. But the breach itself, as devastating as it was, is only the first half of this story. Because even genetic data that was never hacked, never stolen, freely and knowingly submitted, has quietly become something its owners never fully anticipated: a law enforcement tool. Go back to April of 2018, to a case that had haunted investigators in California for over 4 decades. A masked serial predator, responsible for a horrifying string of rapes and murders throughout the 1970s and 1980s, had evaded identification for so long that many assumed he'd died or would never be found. Investigators took DNA collected from decades-old crime scenes and, instead of running it through the FBI's traditional criminal database, uploaded it to a public genealogy website ordinarily used by hobbyists building family trees. The site didn't return an exact match. It returned distant cousins, people with no idea their relatives' genetic fingerprint would ever be used this way. From that scattered web of third and fourth cousins, investigators built out an entire family tree, narrowing hundreds of possibilities down to one man, a former police officer, ultimately identified and convicted as the Golden State Killer. It was a triumph of justice that captivated the world. It also quietly opened a door that has never fully closed since. Here's the detail that separates this from ordinary forensic DNA work, and it's the detail almost nobody outside the field fully understands. The FBI's own criminal database, built under a law passed in 1994, deliberately uses what scientists call junk DNA, genetic markers that reveal essentially nothing about your health, your appearance, or your relatives, useful only for confirming an exact identity match, much like a fingerprint. The Supreme Court itself, in a landmark 2013 ruling, upheld warrantless DNA collection from arrestees, specifically because the court believed those markers were narrow and identity only, contained safely within a government-controlled system. But consumer genealogy databases work completely differently. They analyze broad swaths of your actual genome, the same genetic markers tied to health conditions, physical traits, and family relationships. And once law enforcement began cross-referencing those two systems, researchers discovered something the original court decision never anticipated. Combining harmless government DNA markers with the richer profiles held by consumer genealogy companies can reveal deeply private health and identifying information that was never supposed to be accessible at all. The wall between just for catching criminals and a window into your entire genetic life turned out to be far thinner than anyone in that courtroom imagined. Since the Golden State Killer case, this technique, formerly called forensic or investigative genetic genealogy, has expanded into a standard part of the American law enforcement toolkit, used to crack cold cases that had sat unsolved for decades, and to identify unknown human formal guidance encouraging its use for serious unsolved violent crimes, and has funded prosecutors' offices specifically to expand the technique. And here is the part of this story that should make every person who has ever taken a consumer DNA test pause. You don't need to have committed any crime or even have any relative who has to end up entangled in an investigation. The mathematics of genetic relatedness mean that once enough people upload their DNA to these public genealogy sites, nearly every person of European descent in the United States can theoretically be identified through a distant cousin's account. Whether that cousin ever imagined their hobby of tracing the family tree would one day hand investigators a map leading straight back to a stranger they'd never met. Only a handful of states have moved to rein this in. Maryland and Montana became the first to require a warrant before investigators can search consumer genetic databases, unless the person whose data is being searched has explicitly waived that privacy right. Florida passed a law declaring genetic information the exclusive property of the individual it belongs to, enforced through criminal penalties for misuse. But for the vast majority of the country, no such protection exists at all, Whether your genetic data can be quietly searched by police without your knowledge, without a warrant, without you ever being suspected of anything, still depends almost entirely on which state you happen to live in. A patchwork of protection so uneven that your genetic privacy effectively changes the moment you cross a state line. And that brings the story to its most unsettling turn yet, because private companies and local police departments are not the only ones expanding their genetic reach. The federal government has been quietly building its own genetic surveillance infrastructure, and the scale of that expansion has occurred with almost no public debate at all. It began with a law passed in 2005, permitting the collection of DNA from certain federal arrestees. But in 2020, that authority was dramatically expanded, mandating that DNA be collected from virtually every migrant detained at the border, regardless of how briefly they were held, regardless of whether they were ever charged with a crime. The numbers reveal just how staggering that expansion became in practice. In 2019, detained non-citizens represented roughly 0.2% of all profiles inside the FBI's national DNA database. By 2023, that figure had rocketed to over 9% of the entire system, an increase of more than 40-fold in just 4 years, adding tens of thousands of people into a permanent federal genetic database, many of whom were never convicted of, or even formally charged with, any crime at all. Researchers examining the policy have raised pointed concerns about its disproportionate impact on migrants of color, and about how little meaningful consent was actually obtained before those samples were taken. Layer all of this together, and a pattern starts to emerge that is easy to miss when you look at any single piece in isolation, but impossible to ignore once you see the whole picture. A private company's breach exposed the genetic data of millions, cascading through family trees to relatives who never consented. A bankruptcy court had to decide whether an entire population's DNA could legally be sold as a business asset. Local police quietly turned family hobbyist websites into an investigative dragnet capable of identifying almost anyone through their distant relatives. And the federal government, largely outside public view, built one of the fastest growing genetic databases in American history, populated heavily by people never convicted of anything. None of these systems were designed by the same people for the same purpose at the same time. And yet together they form something that increasingly resembles a single, sprawling, uncoordinated genetic surveillance apparatus, built not through one dramatic decision, but through 1,000 smaller ones, each justified in isolation, each expanding a little further than the one before it. And underneath all of it sits a gap in American law that most people don't discover until it's too late to matter. A federal law passed back in 2008 prohibits health insurers and employers from discriminating against you based on genetic information. It sounds reassuring until you learn what it doesn't cover. That same law says nothing about life insurance, nothing about disability insurance, nothing about long-term care insurance, meaning a company can, in many states, legally ask whether you've ever taken a genetic test and factor a predisposition to a disease you don't even have yet into whether you're insurable and at what price. The blueprint you sent off out of simple curiosity about your ancestry can, in certain corners of the insurance industry, quietly follow you for the rest of your life. So where does this leave the millions of people who already have a saliva sample sitting in some company's database right now, and the millions more who will send one in next year, drawn in by the same irresistible curiosity about where they come from? It leaves them, and all of us, at a genuine crossroads. Some states are beginning to fight back with genetic privacy laws that treat your DNA as your own property, and warrant requirements finally starting to catch up to what police can actually do with a public genealogy website. Consumer trust in the entire industry has visibly cracked, with demand for these tests falling sharply since the breach became public, forcing companies to finally reckon with security practices they'd neglected for years. And a serious national conversation has finally begun in Congress about what happens the next time. Because either will be a next time. A company holding the genetic blueprints of millions of people collapses, and someone has to decide what happens to the most personal data a human being can possess. But make no mistake about what this story ultimately reveals. Your genetic code is not just information about you. It is information about your parents and your children and cousins you have never met and never will, all of them bound together in a code none of them chose to share. Yet all of them expose the moment just one relative decided to satisfy a simple curiosity. We have spent the last decade learning, sometimes painfully, how to protect our passwords, our credit cards, our digital identities. We are only now beginning to reckon with something far more permanent and far more personal. The fact that the very thing that makes you unforgettably, irreplaceably you is also the one thing you can never truly take back once it leaves your hands. Carry your story well. It has come a very long way.